Welcome to Echo 321, Study Session 11, Foreign Finance, Investment and Aid. Introduction. In this study session, you will examine the international flow of financial resources, which takes three main forms. These forms are private foreign direct and portfolio investment, remittances of earnings by international migrants, and public and private development assistance, which is referred to as foreign aid. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Describe the nature and controversy regarding private direct and portfolio investment and foreign direct investment. 2. Discuss the forms and purposes of foreign aid. And 3. Explain the reason donors give aid and the reason less developed countries accept aid. Foreign aid. The development assistance debate. Foreign aid includes public, bilateral, and multilateral development assistance and private assistance provided by non-governmental organizations. Foreign aid can be defined as any flow of capital to less developed countries with non-commercial donor objectives, characterized by concessional terms. It encompasses all official grants and concessional loans in the currency or in kind that are broadly aimed at transferring resources from developed to less developed nations on development, poverty, or income distribution grounds. AIDS agencies, or as many would see themselves, development institutions at one end of the scale are the very large multilateral lending organizations such as the World Bank and other regionally based development banks. Banks based in the Middle East are an important source of funds for Islamic countries. There are multilateral donors such as the European Union and many bilateral programs run by development countries, e.g., USAID, JICA, and DFID, etc. There are also substantial international NGOs such as Plan International, World Vision, Oxfam, and very many small NGOs. Problems in measuring aid. 1. How to combine value of grants to that of loans. For example, the monetary value of interest-bearing loans should be deflated or discounted before adding them to the value of outright grants. This is because loan must be repaid. 2. The value of aid is reduced if it is tied either by source or by project. For aid tied by source, the money has to be spent on purchase of donor country goods and services, which is likely to be expensive. For aid tied project, the money can only be used for specific projects, e.g. roads, which may not be the highest priority of the recipient. 3. There is need to distinguish between nominal and real value of foreign aid. Forms and purpose of aid. Aid comes in various forms, and they may be secondary purposes in addition to the primary ones of supporting development and poverty reduction. Essentially, aid is the provision of direct and indirect finance for goods and services at costs that are less than what would be charged in the normal open market and provided by an external source. Aid may be conditions attached regarding use of funds or may be tied to the use of certain goods and services. There will normally be an ongoing operation and maintenance implication to any capital equipment provided. The least onerous type of aid from a recipient viewpoint will be grant aid without conditions being attached. This takes the form of a gift. Certain grants that will not be required to be paid back may have to use the services and goods of the donor country without the recipient countries providing much or anything as to its needs or requirements. There is thus no choice offered. At the end of the scale are so-called soft loans that have lower than open market interest rates or long grace periods before repayment is required. The loans may be for the construction of infrastructure, for technical services, or for the empowerment of the people, thus giving them some economic power and independence. Soft loan, usually provided in hard currencies, may turn out to be much less generous than it appears at first sight after taking exchange rate charges during the course of the loan into account. It has been recognized that many poor developing countries have accumulated very high debt, which results in substantial proportion of their GDP being used for debt repayment. This has led to calls for debt relief for heavily indebted poor countries, and this has been arranged in a number of countries that have fulfilled certain priority conditions. These conditions usually involve the adoption of poverty reduction strategies and financial readjustment programs. Aid from a number of major institutions is now mainly or wholly in the forms of grants. Countries which have been accepted for debt relief programs may benefit from debt support or sector-wide programs in which donors adopt a hand-offs approach. This also allows high-level monitoring of the implementation of agreed policy indicators rather than resource-intensive micromanagement of the specific projects, with attendant evidences in AIDS management. Monitoring of such programs is directed more towards checking that the stated poverty reduction policies and financial controls are adhered to, rather than specific project deliverable. These changed modalities for aid delivery are a recent development which has been laid and led by several EU member states, and which puts a great deal of ownership and responsibility for the success in the hands of the recipient government. Effects of AIDS. Number one, the economic traditionalists argue that AIDS has indeed promoted growth and transformation in many countries. 2. Promoting market reforms. 3. Critics of AIDS argue that AIDS does not promote fasting growth, but may in fact retard it by substituting for rather than supplementing domestic savings and investment, and by exacerbating less developed countries' balance of payment deficit as a result of rising debt repayment obligations and the linking of aid to donor country export. Number 4, other critics are that 1. AIDS focuses on and stimulates the growth of modern economy, thereby increasing the gap in living standards between the rich and the poor in developing countries. Foreign aid has been a failure because it has been largely appropriated by corrupt bureaucrats. Dismal record of foreign aid. By the 1990s, the failure of conventional government-to-government aid schemes had been widely recognized, and brought the entire foreign assistance process under scrutiny. For example, a Clinton administration task force considered that, despite decades of foreign assistance, most of Africa and parts of Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East are economically worse off today than they were 20 years ago. Multilateral aid has also played a prominent role in the post-World War II period. The World Bank, to which the United States is the major contributor, was created in 1944 to provide aid mostly for infrastructural projects in countries that could not attract private capital on their own. The World Bank has since expanded its lending functions, as have the 5 regional development banks that have subsequently been created on the World Bank's model. That is, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, and the Middle East Development Bank. Despite record levels of lending, however, the multilateral development banks have not achieved more success at promoting economic growth than as U.S. aid. Numerous self-evaluation of World Bank performances over the last couple of years, for example, have uncovered high failure rates of bank finance projects. Although a small group of countries in the developing world has achieved self-sustaining economic growth, most recipients of aid have not. There are several reasons why massive transfers from the developed to the developing world have not led to a corresponding transfer of prosperity. Aid has traditionally been lent to government, has supported central planning, and has been based on a fundamentally flawed vision of development. By lending to government, U.S. aid and the multilateral development agencies supported by Washington have helped expand the state sector at the expense of the private sector in poor countries. Foreign aid has thus financed governments, both authoritarian and democratic, whose policies have been the principal cause of their country's impoverishment. Trade protectionist, Bisonite licensing schemes, inflation monetary policies, price and wage controls, nationalization of industries, exchange rate control, state-run agricultural marketing boards, and restrictions on foreign and domestic investment, for example, have all been supported explicitly or implicitly by U.S. foreign aid programs. Centralization of economic decision-making is in the hands of political authorities and have meant that a substantial amount of poor countries' otherwise useful resources has been diverted to unproductive activities such as rent-seeking for private interests or politically motivated spending by the state. It has become abundantly clear that as long as the conditions for economic growth do not exist in developing countries, no amount of foreign aid will be able to produce economic growth. Rationales for giving and accepting aid. Reasons for giving aid. The allocation of aid is rarely determined by relative needs of developing countries. Most bilateral aid seems unrelated to development priorities, but is based strategically on political, military, or economic considerations. Multilateral aids play less national biases, but it also seems that the poorest countries do not get more assistance. The donor's motivation may be driven by moral and humanitarian desires to assist less fortunate people. However, there is no evidence to suggest that over longer periods of time, donor nations assist without expecting some benefits or give first priority to recipient needs. Political motivation, where aid is primarily a means of furthering donor countries' interests. The flow of funds tend to vary with the donor's political assessment of changing international institutions. The U.S. foreign aid in the late 1940s was mainly a means of containing the international spread of communism. Recent increases in aid to African countries with public health crises involving HIV assistance may be due to part of the concerns that the AIDS may spread internationally or lead to destabilizing state collapse and possibly happens for terrorists. Political motivations are the most important motivation for donors, especially for the U.S. Those less developed countries considered as geographically strategic to get consideration for support. Successive shifts in emphasis from South Asia to Southeast Asia to Latin America to the Middle East and back to Southeast Asia during the 1950s and 1960s, than towards Africa and the Persian Gulf in late 70s, the Caribbean and the Central America in 1980s, than the Russia Federation, Bosnia, Asia, and Middle East. In the 1990s, reflect the changes in the U.S. strategic interest more than the changes in economic needs. After 2001, it shifted towards countries with Islamic insurgencies. Other major countries that show a similar behavior, but there are also expectations are Sweden, Britain, Norway, and Netherlands and Canada, that at least try to occupy more in accordance with the recipient needs and not exclusively in their own donor interests. Economic motivations. Foreign exchange constraint. The basic argument is that most developing countries face either a shortage of domestic savings to match investment opportunities or a shortage of foreign exchange to finance needed importation of capital and intermediate goods. Foreign aid can play a critical role in supplementing domestic resources in order to relieve savings or foreign exchange bottlenecks. Growth and savings. It is often assumed that foreign aid facilitates and accelerates the process of development by generating additional domestic savings as a result of inducing higher growth rate. It is hoped that the need for concessional aid will appear as local resources become sufficient to make development self-sustaining. Technical assistance. Foreign aid is usually supplemented by technical assistance in the form of high level of workers transfer to ensure that aid funds are used efficiently to generate growth, and a spillover of knowledge and skills can occur. Thus, it serves as a labor gap filling process. Self-interest. There is strong tendency towards providing interest-bearing loans instead of outright grants. Also, there is strong tendency towards tying aid to the export of donor countries. This leads to debt repayment burden and high import cost. Absorptive capacity. The amount of aid should be determined by the recipient country's absorptive capacity, which is its ability to use aid funds efficiently. Typically, donor countries decide which LDCs shall receive aid as well as amount and form, purpose, and condition of aid. The total amount of aid has rarely anything to do with developing countries' absorbing capacity. Promoting market reforms. Much aid is delivered on the condition that recipient countries implement market-oriented economic policies. Such conditionality is the type of the world. Banks' structural adjustment lending, which it began in the early 1980s after it realized that pouring money into unsound economies and that the bank has often been overtly optimistic about the prospect for reform, thereby contributing to misallocation of aid. Enterprise funds are another initiative intended to help market economies. Under this approach, USAID and the overseas private investment corporations have established and financed venture funds throughout the developing world. Their purpose is to promote economic growth and jumpstart the market by investing in the private sector. Numerous evaluations have now found that most enterprise funds are losing money, and many have simply displaced private investment that otherwise would have taken place. Moreover, there is no evidence that the funds that have generated additional private investment had a positive impact on development or helped create a better investment environment in poor countries. Similar efforts to underwrite private entrepreneurs are evident at the World Bank through its expansion program to guarantee private sector investment, and at U.S. agencies such as the Export-Import Bank, OPIC, and the Trade and Development Agency, which provide comparable services. U.S. officials justify those programs on the ground that they help promote development and benefit the U.S. economy. Yet, the provision of loan guarantees and subsidized insurance to the private sector relieves the government of underdeveloped countries from creating an investment environment that will attract foreign capital on its own. Why LDC recipient accept aid? 1. Donor prescriptions. Most less developed countries accept the donor's prescription that aid is a crucial and essential ingredient in the development process that supplement scarce domestic resources, help to transform the economy structurally, and contribute to economic growth. 2. Political leverage. In some countries, both donor and recipient see aid as providing greater political leverage to the existing leadership to suppress opposition and maintain itself in power. In such instances, assistance take the form not only of financial resource transfers, but of military and internal security reinforcement as well. 3. Humanitarian responsibilities. Due to basic humanitarian responsibility and the belief that rich nations owe the less developed countries money for past exploitations, some less developed countries think that rich countries are responsible to support them. There is no doubt that less developed countries need more assistance to escape their cycle of poverty, but new approaches are needed to ensure effectiveness. Summary. In this study session, you learned that multinational corporations are corporations or enterprises that conduct and control productive activities in more than one country. Multinational corporations are interested in maximizing their return on capital. Most multinational corporations' investments are directed to other developed countries, while less developed countries with their small economies may be substantially affected by the presence of multinational corporations. The international flow of financial resources takes three main forms. These are private, foreign, direct, and portfolio investment, remittances of earnings by international migrants, and public-private development assistance. This is the end of study session 11. Thanks for listening.